Forget the massive turkey legs and blazing hearts you see in Hollywood films. If you stepped into a real English tavern in the 11th century, the smell alone would smack you right in the face. Here's the juicy scoop about what folks actually ate and drank in the Middle Ages, and why it was purely a question of survival. To really get what was on the menu in 12th century England, we first have to chuck the fancy restaurant idea out the window. This isn't Michelin-star dining, and dive straight into the muddy, smoke-choked reality of the medieval alehouse. The 11th century, right after the harsh aftermath of the Norman conquest, society was sharply divided, and so were its drinking spots. A true tavern was a fancy spot selling imported wine. Imagine Leroy Musigny Grand Cru, not your everyday plonk, mostly for French-speaking Norman lords, wealthy merchants, and the upper-tier clergy. But for the vast majority of the population, the exhausted peasants, serfs, and laborers, the local watering hole was the alehouse. An alehouse wasn't even a purpose-built commercial building. It was usually just a neighbor's cramped wattle-and-daub crookhouse. You knew it was open for business when the alewife, the woman of the house, who had just finished brewing a fresh, highly perishable batch of drink, shoved an ale stake out her front door. This was a long wooden pole with a bushy evergreen branch tied to the end, signaling to the village that the drink was ready. Stepping inside, you would be instantly hit by a wave of pungent odors. Stale sweat from men who had been working the field since dawn. The sharp tang of wood smoke drifting from the open central hearth, and the thick yeasty scent of boiling grain. The absolute cornerstone of the medieval diet, and the very reason these alehouses existed in the first place, was ale. But this was nothing like the clear carbonate golden lagers of today. 12th century ale was essentially liquid bread. It was thick, cloudy, highly caloric, and completely flat, because untreated river or well water was frequently contaminated with agricultural runoff, or human waste, making it incredibly dangerous to drink. Absolutely everyone in the village, including toddlers, drank this weak ale from sunrise to sunset, just to stay hydrated and energized. Furthermore, hops had not yet been introduced to English brewing. Instead, this early medieval ale was flavored and preserved using gruit, a bitter regional mix of herbs and botanicals like yarrow, mugwort, and heather. Because it lacked the preservative power of hops, it spoiled within days, meaning brewing was a constant, never-ending, and essential chore for the women of the village. When it came to solid food in these alehouses, the absolute undisputed staple of the working-class diet was a humble dish called pottage. If a tired laborer slapped a hard-earned silver penny onto the rough-hewn wooden table, they were not getting a roasted leg of mutton. Pottage was a thick, constantly simmering stew or porridge that sat in a large cast iron or clay pot over the hearth fire all day long. Its base was entirely dependent on what the peasants could grow in their modest village plots. Boiled oats or barley heavily bulked up with tough fibrous vegetables like cabbages, leeks, onions, garlic, turnips, and peas. The beauty of pottage was its versatility. If the alewife had a good week, or if a patron brought something to trade, the pot might be enriched with a bit of precious protein to draw in a bigger crowd. However, this almost never meant fresh beef or pork, which were luxuries mostly reserved for the nobility. Instead, The pottage might be flavored with tough scraps of salted bacon, a bit of dried fish if the village was near the coast, or perhaps some scavenged marrow bones to give the broth some badly needed richness. Accompanying the steaming bowl of pottage was the other non-negotiable dietary staple bread, refined white wheat bread. Known as manchet, was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. The common people ate coarse dark, an extremely dense bread known as massively baked from a rough blend of rye barley and sometimes ground dried peas or beans. This bread was heavy, tough on the teeth, and packed with fiber. It was so sturdy that it was often used as a tool. Peasants would use thick chunks of maslin to scoop up their pottage, soaking up the savory broth and softening the bread enough to chew. It was a monotonous and aggressively fibrous diet, but it was absolutely essential fuel for a population that spent their entire lives engaged in back-breaking manual labor, from the moment the sun rose until it finally set. Once the heavy wooden door of the alehouse swung shut against the biting English chill, you were instantly hit by a wave of raw, unfiltered humanity. In the 11th century, these cramped, smoke-blackened rooms were far more than just a place to grab a cheap drink. They were the true epicenter of village life, and the only real refuge from the crushing weight of the feudal system. Because peasants had almost no free time, and their own wattle-and-daub huts were dark, freezing, and often shared with livestock. The alehouse became their living room, their town hall, and their nightly escape. The air hung thick with the acrid bite of a central peat fire, mingling with the sour tang of spilled ale and, worst of all, the rank perfume of men and women who'd spent 14 relentless hours hacking at stubborn clay soil. Flickering hearth flames and a few sputtering tallow rushlights cast the room in a restless, trembling glow. Cheap candles, dried reeds dipped in rendered animal fat, choked the air with smoke and smelled almost exactly like burnt meat. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, a wild counterpoint to the chaos inside. There was no quiet corner for brooding. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with locals, crowded onto rough-hewn benches, drinking deeply from crude wooden tankards and leather jacks, voices and laughter jostling like the bodies themselves. Ale flowed constantly, but the alewife didn't rely on drink alone. She also served whatever extra provision she had managed to scrounge, forage, or stash away, anything that might keep her patrons drinking a little longer. Alongside the ever-present pottage and rock-hard maslin bread, a lucky customer might even purchase a small chunk of green cheese. Despite the name, this wasn't moldy. In the 12th century, green simply meant fresh, soft, young cheese that hadn't been aged. Hard matured cheeses were valuable trade goods, often reserved for the tables of lords and merchants. Peasants, meanwhile, made do with soft, highly perishable curds from sheep or goat milk, heavily salted in a desperate attempt to slow the inevitable spoilage. Every now and then, the alehouse menu might improve quietly. If a local poacher had dared to challenge the brutal Norman forest laws, which forbade peasants from hunting the king's deer or wild boar under penalties that could include blinding or mutilation, there might be something more exciting roasting over the flames. Perhaps a tough, stringy rabbit. Maybe a few unlucky wood pigeons caught in crude traps. Nothing luxurious, but certainly better than another bowl of boiled greens. Foraging filled the many gaps in their diet. Wild garlic, nettles, watercress, and hazelnuts gathered from the woodland edge were all thrown into the pot. In a world where hunger was never far away, every single calorie mattered, and absolutely nothing was wasted. But the alehouse wasn't just about survival. It was also the social beating heart of the peasantry. Because inside those smoky wooden walls, the strict, rigid rules of medieval society loosened their grip, at least for a few precious hours. It was a place for roaring, fire-lit entertainment, traveling minstrels, and wandering storytellers. Often hoping to earn nothing more than a free bowl of stew, would strum a battered wooden harp and launch into bawdy songs. Others recited grand epic poems about long-dead Anglo-Saxon heroes, their voices rising above the crackle of the hearth and the clatter of mugs. For the villagers packed inside the smoky alehouse, it offered something rare. A brief glimpse of a world far beyond the muddy borders of their little village. Gambling was widespread and fiercely contested. Men hunched over rough wooden tables, playing hazard, a fast-paced and wildly popular dice game introduced by the Normans. Others battled over a strategic board game known as Nine Men's Morris, carefully sliding their pieces across scratch boards carved directly into the tabletops. And the stakes could be shockingly high, especially for men who own almost nothing. One bad roll of the bone dice could cost a man his iron sickle, his woolen tunic, or even a desperately needed sack of seed grain, the very thing that might decide whether his family ate through the winter. Naturally, mixed exhaustion, high-stakes gambling, and gallons of unfiltered ale, and violence was almost inevitable. With no official police force to intervene, a dispute over a cheated dice roll or a stolen sheep was often settled right there on the dirt floor. Fists flew. Wooden stools became weapons. Even the small eating knives worn on belts made cameo appearances. Yet despite the occasional bloody brawl, the alehouse remained a sanctuary dot for a few precious hours. A 12th century peasant could forget the crushing taxes, the back-breaking labor, and the constant shadow of starvation. Here at the bottom of a wooden cup, they found fleeting warmth and a fragile sense of camaraderie. However, the loud, fire-lit sanctuary of the 12th century alehouse could not last forever. Eventually, the night would end, and these exhausted villagers would tumble back down into the cold grip of their everyday lives. As the evening stretched on and the supply of thick, cloudy ale ran dangerously low, the room began to lose its thunder. The booming laughter softened. The clatter of bone dice slowed. Even the scandalous songs of traveling minstrels faded into tired hums. Their brief taste of freedom always had a deadline. And that deadline came in the form of a bell. High in the tower of the local stone church, an iron bell would begin to toll, the village curfew. A rule introduced by the newly entrenched Norman conquerors, partly to prevent catastrophic midnight fires, and partly to discourage any inconvenient late-night rebellions. It was called the curfew, literally cover the fire. And when that bell rang, it wasn't a suggestion. It was the law. Every hearth in the village had to be smothered with ash. Every gathering had to end. And the noisy warmth of the alehouse was replaced by dark streets, cold homes, and the long wait for morning. The night watch, if the village was large enough to have one patrolled aggressively for stragglers. Anyone caught wandering the muddy, unpaved lanes after curfew risked heavy fines from the local sheriff, or far worse, being branded a thief or a dangerous outlaw by fire and steel. With bellies stuffed full of heavy oat-based pottage and minds delightfully numbed by gallons of herb-infused crude ale, the patrons of the alehouse stumbled blindly into the pitch-black English night. There was no famous Shibuya crossing in Japan in the 11th century, only the suffocating absolute darkness of the medieval countryside and the distant, blood-chilling howl of wolves. Through the heavily regulated forests that surrounded their isolated settlements, they navigated back to their freezing wattle-and-daub crook houses by memory and faint moonlight. Their leather boots sank deep into the foul muck of the unpaved roads, each step a slippery, treacherous struggle in the pitch-black night. Waiting for them at home was not a soft feather mattress or a quiet private room. They simply crawled back into the same lice-infested, straw-stuffed pallets they had left nearly 18 hours earlier, curling up beside heavily breathing livestock and soaking in whatever scraps of warmth the animals could offer. The massive quantities of ale they consumed were not simply indulgence. They were essential, providing daily hydration and a bare minimum of calories. But the drink served a deeper purpose as well. It was a kind of crude anesthetic. The thick, cloudy brew helped them momentarily forget the sharp, gnawing pain in their aching joints, and the blistered calluses that covered their hands after endless days of labor. Modern archaeology reveals just how brutal their daily lives truly were. Their teeth were often worn almost completely flat, ground down by the tiny stone grit inevitably mixed into their coarse maslin bread. Their bones carried the unmistakable marks of relentless, lifelong physical strain. They lived in a terrifyingly fragile world where a single failed harvest or an unexpected early frost could push an entire village to the brink of starvation. Yet this grueling cycle of endless agricultural labor, incredibly coarse food, and fleeting escapes to the alehouse forged a population of astonishingly tough, fiercely resilient people. These were working men and women who quite literally built their lives out of the mud beneath their feet. They did not have the imported spices, the heavily salted roasted meats, or the fine French wines enjoyed by their wealthy Norman overlords. But they had something else. They had each other. The communal iron pot of simmering vegetable stew, the rock-hard loaves of dark bread, and the shared wooden tankards of cloudy ale became the glue that held these fragile farming communities together. They shared their meager, hard-won resources. They fiercely protected their neighbors. And somehow, they still found small moments of genuine joy. All in an era that history often remembers only for its darkness and its immense suffering. When dawn finally broke a few short hours later, painting the English sky in pale, freezing shades of gray, the village rooster would crow once again. The brief, desperately needed respite of the night was over. The villagers dragged their aching bodies up from the dirt floor, rubbed the stinging wood smoke from their eyes, and stepped back out into the freezing mud to begin the exact same backbreaking routine all over again. They were the unsung, forgotten engine of medieval England, enduring one heavy bowl of pottage, and one muddy day at a time.